Hello everyone. Before we begin, I just wanted to say that I've changed the name of this channel. It used to be called Occasional Eclectic, but no one knew what that meant. They didn't like saying it, and they couldn't remember it. The channel is now called A Grain of Salt, like the phrase, take it with a grain of salt. Anyways, enjoy the video. In October of 1953, 2 months after the Korean War had ended, the United States and South Korea signed a mutual defense treaty in which both countries pledged to defend one another from outside attacks. Meaning we can all count on South Korea's help when Mexico finally decides they want their land back. But another part of the treaty allowed the United States to station military forces in South Korea. And that's exactly what they did, keeping at least 40,000 soldiers in South Korea for the next 2 decades. But some of those soldiers found themselves in sticky situations, the kind of situations that can only be fixed by fleeing into one of the most oppressed and malnourished countries on the planet. Lord knows we've all had problems like that. So this is the story of the 4 American soldiers who defected to North Korea and became movie stars. The first soldier to defect was Private Larry Abshier from Urbana, Illinois. After becoming a foster child at the age of 14, Abshier enlisted in the military a few years later and was stationed at the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea. But old Larry had a penchant for smoking the ganja, being caught with weed multiple times. Facing a court-martial, Abshier decided it was better to live in North Korea than to face America's brutal drug laws. So on May 28, 1962, he crossed the DMZ, which was covered in landmines, and surrendered to the North Koreans. Everyone kind of assumed Abshier was on another one of his famous marijuana benders until 2 weeks later, when North Korea's Radio Pyongyang announced that he had defected. The North Koreans quickly put him to work, making Abshier go on the radio and read statements like, "I have never seen such a clean and cultural city as Pyongyang. Overflowing with happiness, the North Korean people are all leading free, happy, and peaceful lives and working hard and diligently constructing for a happier tomorrow," which is probably the most anyone has ever sounded like a gun is being pointed at their head. Although he was the only American in North Korea for a few months, Abshier soon gained the company of Private First Class James Dresnok from Norfolk, Virginia. As sad as Abshier's life had been, Dresnok had it much worse. When he was a kid, his mother fled from his father with James and his brother, the 3 of them living in a car while Mrs. Dresnok resorted to prostitution to make ends meet. When they were found, Dresnok's father gained total custody of James, only to drive him several hours away and abandon him. So Dresnok also ended up in a foster home and also decided to join the military with nowhere else to turn. He spent 2 years in West Germany before returning home to find that his wife had been cheating on him, so he divorced her and re-enlisted, this time being sent to the DMZ in South Korea. And it wasn't long before Dresnok found himself in trouble, facing a court-martial for going AWOL after forging his sergeant's signature on paperwork allowing him to leave the base. 3 hours before that court-martial on August 15, 1962, Dresnok crossed the DMZ and surrendered to North Korea. The next year, the 2 defectors were joined by Corporal Jerry Parrish of Morganfield, Kentucky. And don't worry, his backstory is significantly less tragic than Abshier and Dresnok. Although his parents were divorced, he was never sent to foster care and his mother wasn't a prostitute, so all things considered, he had it made. He worked at a farm with his father as a teenager, but was eventually fired and joined the military. Parrish is easily the most confusing of the defectors, as he was facing no trouble at all when he crossed the DMZ on December 6, 1963. But some reports have indicated that he fled because his stepfather believed he was sleeping with his stepsister and had threatened to kill him. Now that's the kind of thing they don't put in the porn. The totally reliable Radio Pyongyang said that Parrish had defected because he heard that everyone in North Korea has a job, which is the funniest reason they could have given. According to them, he was shocked by the miserable life of the South Korean people and decided to go to North Korea where everyone is famously loving life. Say what you want about Radio Pyongyang, but they actually won 17 Pulitzers in 10 years. And if you believed that, you're exactly the audience Radio Pyongyang is looking for. The final of the defection quartet was Sergeant Charles Jenkins of Rich Square, North Carolina. After dropping out of high school following the death of his father, Jenkins enlisted in the Army at the age of 18 and later volunteered to deploy to South Korea. But in 1965, rumors began to swirl that Jenkins' unit was going to be sent to Vietnam. To avoid that, he went into the only place that was arguably worse. After leaving behind a note that said, "Forgive me, for I know what I must do. Tell my family I love them," Jenkins drank a hearty 10 beers, tied a white t-shirt to the muzzle of his rifle, and walked across the DMZ. Although it was probably more of a stumble than a walk if those 10 beers had anything to say. Apparently he had hoped to claim asylum with North Korea's ally, the Soviet Union, and then return to the US in a prisoner exchange. But Jenkins was not an 8-time WNBA All-Star, so the prisoner exchange he was hoping for didn't happen. So now that we've met our cast of characters, what did they all get up to in their northern excursion? Well, to begin, they were all brutally tortured by the North Korean government. The men were forced to memorize North Korean propaganda and were beaten if they forgot it. Jenkins had a US military tattoo on his arm, which was apparently cut off without anesthesia. Eventually, the 4 defectors were put into a one-room house together, which was wired with microphones and cameras. And if the government had thought to televise the footage, they would have had the greatest reality show that side of the DMZ. And like any great reality show, the cast was constantly butting heads. Apparently, Dresnok would frequently bully Abshier by doing things like making a mess and forcing Abshier to clean it up. Abshier was reportedly not the sharpest tool in the shed, causing Dresnok and Parrish to give him the nickname Lenny after the character from John Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men. But don't feel too bad, because if he really wasn't very bright, then he probably didn't get the reference anyway. Jenkins encouraged Abshier to resist the bullying, and when Dresnok finally tried to attack Abshier, Jenkins came to Abshier's defense by beating Dresnok. And that's just a taste of the drama we could have seen on the reality show that almost was. All 4 of the men were used quite heavily for North Korean propaganda, appearing on magazine covers and on the radio. They had to teach English to North Korean soldiers to help turn them into spies, and they were even brought to the DMZ and forced to try and convince other soldiers to defect over the loudspeakers. Because nothing says you're happy to be somewhere like getting on a loudspeaker and telling everyone how happy you are. And some of them were certainly happier than others, and by some of them I mean Dresnok, who was apparently the most loyal to the North Korean regime and would frequently report the secrets of the others to the government. But even he was not happy enough to decline joining the men's only escape attempt in 1966, when all 4 of them slipped into the country's Soviet embassy. They were hoping that the Russians would give them asylum, but the Russians simply returned them to their captors. And you can only imagine how awkward that reunion was. In fact, it took several years for the North Korean government to trust the 4 men again, but it seems things were patched over by 1972 when all 4 men were awarded North Korean citizenship, which I'm sure they were all thrilled about. They were also finally given their own homes and even their own wives. The government was hoping they would reproduce to create children who could become spies. But North Korean custom was against the idea of Koreans reproducing with Americans, so they had to find non-Koreans to marry these guys. And by find, I mean cruelly kidnap. Abshier's wife was a Thai woman named Anocha Panjoy, Dresnok's wife was a Romanian woman named Doina Bambea, Parrish's wife was a Lebanese woman named Saham Shraite, and Jenkins' wife was a Japanese woman named Hitomi Soga. All of these women were kidnapped or tricked into coming to North Korea solely to become the wives of the Americans. But at least 3 of them could take solace in the fact that they didn't end up with Dresnok. Occasionally, the defectors' jobs as slaves to North Korea allowed them to show off their creative side. In 1978, Kim Jong-Il, who was the head of propaganda at the time, employed the Americans as actors in a series of movies he was making. Known as Unsung Heroes, the series was over 20 hours long, and the defectors each played different American villains throughout the movies. Abshier played Carl, a captain in the US Secret Service. Dresnok played Arthur, a US Army lieutenant colonel and POW camp commander. Parrish played Lewis, an Army lieutenant who sees the light and converts to communism. And Jenkins played Dr. Kelton, the mastermind behind the Korean War. I'm guessing Jenkins was the best actor of the bunch because it sounds to me like they gave him the juiciest role. But apparently it was Dresnok who became a fan favorite, achieving celebrity status in North Korea to the point that people would recognize him in public and call him Arthur after his character's name. And after the success of the Unsung Heroes cinematic universe, the Americans were called upon by Kim Jong-il for a few more film appearances, especially Jenkins and Dresnok, who had apparently become the Tom Hanks and Robert De Niro of North Korea. One of Dresnok's big roles was in the film From 5 p.m. to 5 a.m., in which he plays an American general who the North Korean heroes have only 12 hours to defeat. With roles that good, it almost makes the whole North Korean life imprisonment sound pretty nice. Over the years, the boys settled into their lives, not that they had much of a choice. They all learned Korean and started families with their wives. But just after midnight on July 11, 1983, Abshier had a heart attack. His wife called for Jenkins to help, as he was their neighbor at the time, but by the time Jenkins arrived, Abshier had already passed away. He was only 40 and had spent 21 years in North Korea, leaving him at a North Korean life percentage of 52.5%. But perhaps Abshier was lucky because he got to miss the North Korean famine of the 90s. Also known as the March of Suffering, the famine lasted 4 years and killed between 240,000 and 3.5 million North Koreans. It's quite the range there, but I guess they're not a nation of census takers. The famine ended in 1998, which is the same year that Parrish died of kidney failure. He clocks in at a North Korean life percentage of 64.8%. I hope that stepsister was worth it. So that left Jenkins and Dresnok, who were probably the two most interesting members of the group anyways, so it works out well from a narrative standpoint. After becoming a celebrity and having children, Dresnok adapted to North Korean life. His wife died of cancer in 1997, but he remarried and had a third child. In 2006, he was the subject of a documentary called Crossing the Line, in which he was interviewed by the filmmakers. Dresnok insisted that he loved living in North Korea and wouldn't return to America for any amount of money. Not that anybody was offering. Dresnok died of a stroke in November of 2016 after 54 years in North Korea, which amounted to 72.9% of his life. Two of his sons have followed in his footsteps, appearing as evil Americans in North Korean films. I guess the apple doesn't fall far from the DMZ. I know that joke was horrible, but you're too deep into this video to stop now. Then there was Jenkins, whose life took an unexpected turn. In 2002, Japan and North Korea signed the Pyongyang Declaration, which was intended to help relations between the two countries. It didn't really do that, but it did result in North Korea returning 5 kidnapped Japanese people. One of those people was Hitomi Soga, the wife of Charles Jenkins. She returned to Japan alone in October of 2002. Technically, the North Korean government only allowed her to go for 10 days, but she unsurprisingly never came back. In 2004, North Korea allowed Jenkins and his 2 daughters to meet up with Soga in Indonesia, where they were promised residency by the government of Japan. And with that, Charles Jenkins had escaped North Korea. When he arrived in Japan, Jenkins weighed only 100 pounds and had lost both his appendix and 1 testicle. But who needs a testicle when you have your first taste of freedom in 39 years? A couple months later, Jenkins showed up outside the US military base Camp Zuma in Japan. He surrendered and faced a court-martial. Ultimately, Jenkins was dishonorably discharged and sentenced to 30 days confinement, which ended up being 25 days for good behavior. If you're wondering why his punishment was so light for betraying the United States and joining one of their biggest enemies, it's because he told the US military everything he knew about North Korea. Although Jenkins did briefly return to the US to be reunited with his 91-year-old mother, he chose to live in Japan with his family, where he was also treated as a celebrity by the locals. He and his wife chose to stay together after all those years of forced marriage, having fallen in love over a shared hatred of North Korea. So perhaps it was all worth it for this cute love story. It definitely wasn't, but we'll take what we can get. In 2008, Jenkins released a memoir called The Reluctant Communist, which is how we know most of the stuff I've talked about in this video. He died in December of 2017 at the age of 77. His final North Korean life percentage was 50.6%. Meaning Charles Jenkins gave half his life and half his testicles to a nation that will always remember him as a cinema legend. And that's the story of the 4 American soldiers who defected to North Korea and became movie stars. So if you're an American who's out of work, just remember, they're always looking for actors in North Korea. Now please consider subscribing or I'll take your appendix and one of your balls.